Hello.
Hey, wie geht's?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks very much. You know some German?
Ja, ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch.
Oh, ein bisschen Deutsch sogar.
Ein
Super.
klein bisschen Deutsch. Wenn du langsam sprichst, kann ich ein bisschen verstehen. Ein bisschen verstehen.
Das ist schön. Wie,
Ja,
wie kommt es? Wie hast du gelernt? Wie hast du Deutsch gelernt?
ich wohnte in Deutschland 6 Monate,
Aha,
wenn ich 25 war.
aha,
Ungefähr in Uni.
spannend. Spannend.
Erasmus, kennst du?
Right.
Erasmus.
Erasmus,
Ich habe
yes.
Erasmus gemacht. In Leipzig.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yep. The speaking is very rusty, but if somebody speaks
Well,
slow to me,
good enough. I mean,
yeah, if it's like if somebody speaks slowly to me, I can still understand a lot.
well, that was fun.
Mhm.
So how should I call you? Dr. Gil, Dr. How do I pronounce your last name?
Carvalho, but however it comes out.
So Gil is
No,
fine.
yeah, Gil, absolutely, yeah.
Gil is good. Okay, so Gil, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to me today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you on my show, and maybe tell me about what you do, who you are, and you're not a practicing physician as far as I can recall from your videos, but you are an MD and you have a PhD, and so let's start there. Let's start where you're currently at in your life.
Sure. Yeah, my background, I went to medical school here in Europe, actually did a semester in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finished grad school, when I graduated, I wanted to do research. I wanted to get more of a background in basic science. So I applied to get a PhD, and I moved to the US and went to grad school over there for a number of years. And then since then, I pretty much have done full-time research the whole time. And I recently moved back to Europe
Mm-hmm.
for family reasons, but my entire professional background has been in research. So from genetics and biology of aging to neurobiology involving the effect of nutrients on physiology and aging as well, in the work biogerontology that we did in grad school. Yeah, like I've touched a bit of it on different aspects of biology.
Was it medical school first and then your scientific
Yes.
endeavors?
Yes, medical school was first. So right after high school, as here in Europe, as you know, that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., it's a little different, but here in Europe, you go right after high school, and then as soon as I graduated medical school, I started. I went to grad school in the U.S. and started working on a PhD. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how did your desire to study medicine came about? So that's an interesting question that many people ask me as a medical student, because I'm also a medical student here in Berlin. And so
Okay.
so many people ask me like, yeah, some people are like, yeah, like how did you know we're going to study medicine? I'm being like, yeah, that's a funny question, because I knew that I wanted to do something with people and with medicine when I was like 10. So that's a funny thing. And so how was it in your case?
Yeah, I always had an interest in science from childhood, similar to you, and that medicine was kind of was the application that I knew, the scientific application that I was closest to me. A lot of my family members are doctors as well, both on mom's side and dad's side. So that's the one I knew the best, and so that's how I started. And then during medical school, I became more familiar with all the different applications, the clinical side, the research side, the teaching side, all these different things you can do with medicine and science in general.
Did you ever teach apart from your YouTube content that you release?
Yeah, well, I was never like a full-time teacher, but both in medical school and in grad school, there's a strong component, especially grad school. There's a strong component of teaching assistantship and stuff like that. They include it in your curriculum, so you're expected to teach.
While still being a student, or after you finished medical school already?
One second.
Work? Yeah, sure.
Isso ouve aqui, mãe. Música. Sorry about that.
No problems.
Yeah, I was in medical school. There was some teaching. Always, you teach like the people that are starting, right? You teach like your underclassmates.
So you still being a student, you help, people students from starting in the first semester, basically.
Right. As you get through the classes and the curriculum, you then start helping to teach as a TA the younger students. And in medical school, it was more unstructured, it was more voluntary. But in graduate school, it's quite it's part of the curriculum. Like you have to do it as mandatory.
Right, yeah, I see. So it's mandatory, it's part of the curriculum. Because I know there are many medical students also in my medical school from higher semester that offer basically their services in terms of teaching. There are certain programs where medical students can be involved in when it comes to teaching, but it's by no means mandatory. It's all on a voluntary basis. All being done on a voluntary basis. Yeah.
Grad school, at least it depends also which school you go to. But the one I went to in LA, it's part of the program. You have to teach for, I forget if it's 3 or 4 years. You have to some of your time has to be spent teaching and creating the problem sets and grading the problem sets and all this stuff, the teaching side.
And could you choose the topics they were going to teach, or was it also basically told what you're going to tell the students, or was it something that you could decide on your own?
There's some flexibility. So in the beginning, when you're the first or second year, because you're kind of coming in, they assign you to certain classes. I see. But as you get further and further along, and as you get to know people, you can ask to be placed in certain subjects. Yeah.
Okay. And so you said you went through medical school, then you did your scientific studies and research, and you were also teaching apart from studying. And so how did you enjoy the teaching process? Because that's something which some people are good at. In my experience, I've had that when I was like in high school or in Berlin, it's called Gymnasium, whatever. It's like, you're probably aware of these different terms. And so I've always been someone who was quite good at explaining complicated stuff to other students. And there were just people who didn't have this talent, I would say. I don't know whether it's a talent, but how did you enjoy the teaching process? Because that would be an interesting thing.
I think a part of it, I always enjoyed it. I don't know that I had a natural talent. I think a part of it I did like, but for example, I remember hearing pretty early on from a number of people that I was good at teaching, that would be good, that's something I could do, and I did enjoy it. But I can tell you that, for example, making these videos over the last several years, I feel that I started out, there was a lot that I had to learn in terms of breaking stuff down, how to present a topic. Like, that's a huge learning curve. And I feel like I'm still learning every day sometimes I feel like I understand a topic and we go to make a video and I realize that there's a lot of things that breaking it down and teaching it to somebody who's hearing it for the first time is very different from just thinking, oh yeah, I understand this concept. It requires a different level of computation. I don't know. It's not harder or easier. It's just different. If I'm going to explain this to another scientist, it's one thing, and if I'm going to explain it to somebody with no scientific background, it's just a different language, I would say.
Absolutely, and I can remember I had a history teacher who was always telling us the same thing over and over again, that if you really want to see whether you understood a topic thoroughly enough, then a good thing to test that is to go to someone who doesn't know anything, like nothing about this topic at all, who is a total beginner, or maybe not a total beginner, but someone who is not as advanced in when it comes to this topic as you are, and then trying to explain this phenomenon to that person so that the person is actually able to understand what you're saying. So that's a
Yep.
good test. And so, and yeah, I've encountered that also over the course of my, as a side job, I'm like doing maths for college student, not college student, no, that's the wrong word, for high school and middle school students, something like that. And not maths and biology, etc. And I particularly enjoy teaching biology because in medicine you do lots of biology and chemistry and stuff like that. And so, but we do it, as you know, in a very like we study the material really thoroughly. So it's not on a superficial level. We go really deep into the matter. And
Right.
then if you have if you have a middle school student who needs help in biology, then you really need to watch carefully what bits of the knowledge that you have you should take and deliver to the student so that you don't overwhelm the student with too much information, but present them with enough information that actually benefits him in terms of his views and knowledge base, whatever. So
I completely agree with that. One of the hardest thing about making these videos is precisely choosing which information to include. Sometimes I feel like we go a little too far and we try to cram too much into a 5 or 10 minute video. And I can tell from the feedback that people get confused or they get a little overwhelmed. And sometimes we don't put enough detail. And people complain and they say, well, why didn't you talk about that and that?
Right.
So it's
you can't please everyone, because they're gonna be like geeks who gonna criticize you because you didn't go deep enough into the matter, and there are gonna be those who don't understand anything, don't know anything about science and medicine, and gonna be like, yeah, why you're actually using all these complicated terms? You could break it down so much simpler, etc. So you obviously cannot please everyone with this method, but you know, you're trying your best.
Yeah, you learned that early on. I think making content on the internet. I think I assume everybody who does it has this experience. No matter what you do, you can never please everybody.
No.
Even when you do the best you can, there's always somebody who thinks, something was missing, or it wasn't the angle they like, or you didn't say the thing they wanted to be said. But at the same time, there's always somebody who finds it useful, and there's always encouragement. So it just, you just keep going and you keep polishing and keep getting better. And you look for areas where you can offer value. You look for things where you feel like you have a decent understanding of the topic, and at the same time, people are interested in that topic and it can help people in some way. And you just keep, carving a niche like that. I think that's the way to go.
How did it all start with your YouTube channel? Because you don't just start a YouTube channel. I mean, you had to put some thought into that.
I kind of did. I kind of just started.
Oh, you kind of just started out of nothing.
Kind of, and if you go back to the first videos, we didn't really delete the early videos. We only delete videos if the science changes and what I said isn't quite correct anymore. Then we take them down because we don't want to mislead. But for example, the first couple of videos that I made are still up there, and you can see that it's raw. Like there's no image. It's just me kind of just talking into a computer, and you can see the evolution. The first few videos, I'm incredibly awkward in front of the camera because I'm like alone in a room. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to do with my hands. All this stuff. So you can see that evolution clearly. And so I kind of just started. I knew that I wanted to convey scientific information that I knew was abundant in the literature, and that the vast majority of people had no access to, that they don't even know it's out there.
Right.
And I knew, and I suspected at least, that there was interest, at least in some people. And so, but there was this gap between the science that's available and the public. And I also saw that there was a lot of content on the internet that was public facing, that wasn't necessarily the most substantial in terms of the scientific content. And so I knew that there was a need to bridge those two worlds. I didn't know initially if I thought about writing a book. I thought about doing a podcast. I thought about writing a blog. And then I kind of landed on the YouTube idea because I like face-to-face. So in a weird way, YouTube is face-to-face for the viewer, not so much for the content creator. But I think for my personality, it was a better fit overall than like writing on a blog. So that's why I kind of started it. And then I just kind of kept going and kept trying to improve a little bit every time. Still doing that. So
right. I can't quite remember when I came across a YouTube channel, but it was something about 2 or 3 years ago.
okay.
I think it was when I found was it 2 years ago? You made a response to the Game Changers, and that was the first video I saw. It was quite
Yeah.
popular on your YouTube channel.
Yeah.
As far as I can remember, yeah, it's one of the most popular ones.
Yeah.
And what I particularly enjoyed about your content was your humility that you're tried to display in every one of your videos, because you didn't claim to know every answer, and just by stating what you just stated, that you underwent an evolution over these years, that you started by, and you actually also revisited your old videos and you deleted some of them in order to keep what would you say, in order to make it so that it stays in accordance with the most updated scientific literature. And so that's a great thing. And I didn't necessarily, because we all have certain biases, and I didn't necessarily agreed with every single thing you said on your YouTube channel, but just watching your content, I found it great to listen to you, and it didn't trigger me as so many of other, content creators which just were, even if you said the same thing, but the manner in which you were talking, I just really enjoyed listening to you, and really enjoyed make me question my own belief systems, because there are certain things which I would interpret differently, and we can get into some of these topics. But just one thing I wanted to let you know, that the manner in which you you talk and try to explain these things, it's quite appealing to many people, I would say, because it definitely had that effect on me.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you.
Right.
I can tell you that when I look back to videos that I made 2 or 3 years ago, I don't agree with some things I said anymore. Now, I would make a distinction between sometimes. So some of the videos that we deleted were things that at the time the evidence was leaning one way, let's say, and then later new evidence came and pointed the other direction. So I took those down. But for example, if I go watch the Game Changers video, there's definitely, let's put it this way, if I were to remake that video today, I would sound different, right? The way, it's not necessarily that there's something that I said that is grievously wrong in the scientific sense. It's more that the way you approach the topic, or the way you explain things, or the angle evolves with time. And I think one thing that is nuance is, as you understand more and more and you learn more and more, I think you add nuance to a topic. And so even, it's a relatively short time if you think about it in the grand scheme, 3 years, but even there, I mean, you can learn a lot in 3 years. And I would definitely, I think it's noticeable. I could be wrong, you tell me, but videos that I publish now are much more nuanced and much more qualified,
right,
than that video was. But I mean, I'm not, I think it's part of our evolution, and that's what I've learned, with other things that I've done, is to not be embarrassed, and in fact to kind of embrace that process of getting better, that process of improvement, because there's nobody that just out of the womb starts doing something amazing. Everything that anybody achieves.
You have to be a fool first. You have to be stupid and a fool first.
Sure, yeah. And you have to be okay with, I mean, we were talking about language, right? About learning German or whatever it may be.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great example. You have to be willing to make mistakes and to look incompetent in that area for years before you can speak a language fluently. So, I mean, in English, it would be another example. I didn't learn English from an early age. I learned, well, as maybe, I don't know, 10, 12, I started learning English. But it's the same logic. Like you have to keep improving, keep learning, and not have too much of an ego about these things.
So I just want to quickly come back to the fact that you learned English. You started learning English when you were 10 or 12. So where did you come from originally?
Portuguese mom and Brazilian dad.
Ah,
Yeah.
Portuguese and Brazilian. So you came from where? To
I lived in both of those places actually.
in
So
both of those places.
I was
And then
born.
you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Born in Lisbon,
Mhm.
moved to Brazil when I was like 2 years old, and then spent a bunch of time in Brazil, a bunch of time in Africa, and then back to Portugal for another decade or so, and then to the U.S. in my
Oh, so
20s.
that's interesting. In your
Yeah.
20s. Ah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it was fun, but it still sounds interesting because you'd seen different places. And just I'm curious to know, because I've never been in Brazil and neither have I been in Portugal so far. So where so far do you enjoy living the most? So which place did you like the most so far? And that's maybe a difficult question because
It's
like,
hard.
look, I also was raised bilingually because my dad is from Germany, my mom is from Russia. So,
Okay.
and I've been in Russia several times. I was born here in Germany, but I speak both languages and I've visited the country many times because my grandma was living there and part of my family. And so it's different there. And I can't quite say which country I like more because there's something about Russia which I deeply which I which deeply which I deeply love, which I don't have here in Germany. Maybe it's the culture, maybe it's the people, but then maybe like quality of life and environment and how clean it is in the cities. It's definitely better here in Germany. So it's hard to tell. But what's your experience been like traveling in
Similar.
different places?
Yeah, it's similar. It's hard. Like telling you which country I like the most. Period. It would be like asking me if I love my dad or my mom more, right? It's like it's a hard thing because you have a different relationship, but it's not that you love one person more. So with the countries, it's similar. You have a different relationship with each country, and I loved living in the U.S., for example, but I'm here now. I don't miss it necessarily. I'm happy here now. So yeah, it's like, and I love going to Brazil. I have family there. I go, every once in a while. So it's just a different place. In order to live long term, I probably wouldn't live in Brazil for different reasons, safety and things like that. But
I see.
I love going there. I love spending time there. So yeah, I would probably choose either a European country. The U.S. was good. There's also some issues that I have with the U.S. and that's actually it's getting in a way it's getting worse with time. All these gun issues and all these things that are now, more exuberant than ever, and race issues and all these things that,
Right.
financial disparities, the healthcare system. Anyway, there's all these structural problems in the United States that that make living there not necessarily harder, but I don't know, frustrating that you see these disparities and these problems that are not necessarily being addressed. But yeah,
Would you say is it because you feel frustrated because the problems they stay and they're not being really addressed and solved, or because things are moving in the wrong direction? So what is it there? Because you might say things are definitely moving in a certain direction, and you could say I don't like direction things are moving, but at least something is being done, or it seems as if things move in a direction, but actually they don't really. There's like certain groups just shouting to each other and nothing is really happening at all. Or what has your sense been? Because I only had the opportunity to follow the political, what would you say, the political disputes online or through social media or podcasts, etc. So I wasn't there obviously and couldn't really experience how it is to live there and be surrounded by these things constantly. So yeah,
I think
what's
it's
your thoughts on that?
complex. With some things there is evolution. With I would say with civil rights, over time, over decades, you clearly see an evolution. Well, for example, acceptance of race, acceptance of same-sex marriage, things like that. While I was there, I saw that evolving, right? But other things that the progress is extremely slow, and sometimes it feels like it's not moving. When I say frustrating, by the way, what I mean is, like, you see the injustice, right? When you, for example, I lived in LA. LA is a beautiful city, amazing city to live. I lived there for almost 20 years. But the disparity between people who have a lot and people who have nothing is enormous. And so when you go to these parts of town where there's just streets and streets covered with homeless people in certain parts, it's amazing to see in a city with so much wealth, to see entire blocks of the city covered with tents of homeless people.
Right.
And this year after year after year, and not that much institutionally is done. That's just one example, right? But
right.
There's, at some levels and with certain issues, there's very little political will to tackle these issues. And so that's, maybe frustrating isn't the right word. It may be, I don't know, it's like difficult to see people in these conditions and to not see more of a social and political response.
Well, yeah, but I've been also thinking about the whole inequality issue, and I think we underestimate the severity of that problem, not because we don't see that the problem exists, or or because we for some reason stay blind to it or something like that. It's more that I think it's a way more complicated problem than we try to make it to be, because I think there's no easy fix for inequality. It's something way more complicated than we imagine, because like you've said, there's lots of people, there's some people that have a lot and lots of people that don't seem to have anything. And I think, yeah, the question now is, what's the right way to approach it? And there's no clear answer to that, as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
I mean, it's extremely complicated, because that's an interesting phenomenon. You have it everywhere, that things accumulate in the hands of few people. Like you even have it in artistic endeavors or podcasting. There's a couple podcasts that have all the listeners, and like most of it don't have any listeners at all. Or like soccer players, 10 people score all the goals, 10 people sell all the books. It's hard to tell whether this is a phenomenon that just happens. And now the question is, how do we fix it at all?
Right. I think there's clearly an imbalance of potential, or maybe potential is not the right word, but there's clearly an imbalance of resources. Let's put it that way. I think the difference is, in some countries, for example, in some European countries, or for example, when I go to certain Asian countries, poverty exists a little bit everywhere, but not to the extent that it exists, for example, in the US or in Brazil, where it's so dramatic and the gap is just brutal. I think the difference is that everywhere you're going to see an imbalance. You're going to see some people that are just better at, securing resources and accumulating them. But I think the difference is that the political and the social system can be there to provide a minimum of resources to the people who are, for one reason or another, we don't need to get into whether it's merit or whether it's the position they're born in. Leaving that aside, the social network can be there to support the people who have the least in some countries, and to de-emphasize this massive gap, right? Whereas in other countries, for example, in the United States, the political system is geared to exaggerate those differences. That's, to me, the thing that's so politics in the U.S. is a plutocracy, right? It's commanded by the people who have power, and the whole goal is structured to increase the power of those who already have it. So you just see the widening of that gap, decade after decade. So that's the part that's more frustrating. I don't have a problem with there being disparity. That's always going to be there, right? Some people are just better at things and move faster through the ranks. That's completely normal, and I think to a large extent, people should be rewarded for moving faster, and for there should be a meritocracy in place. I have no problem with that. But what I think is unfair is when the system is geared to increase even more the disparity, to take away from the people who already have almost next to nothing, and give more and more and more to the ones who already have too much. That's where I find it unfair.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge issue. And maybe I've heard, I can't remember the name of the author of the book, but I've heard him speak on a thing. It was on the Jordan Peterson podcast. It was, if I remember correctly. But the book he wrote is called 10, something along the lines of 10 positive global trends every person should know, or something like that. And maybe having a look at that book might help you to, reduce the amount of frustration that has accumulated over time, because he tries to make the point that yes, there's still major issues plaguing the planet, plaguing the world, but there is still like many trends that we can observe where things have actually gotten much better over the past decades. And and that's why we shouldn't be, the point he's trying to make is we shouldn't be too cynical about the system, because it has actually produced some positive outcomes, and there's still certain things to solve. And I've actually listened to that podcast, and I came in with the attitude that things are horrible and getting worse, because that's the picture that we're being shown over the past years. It's things are falling apart, climate is falling apart, everything is falling apart. And I mean, it's true to some extent. And then I listened to that podcast, and it didn't completely change my perspective, because things are still worse enough in order to not keep ignoring them. But it at least induced some positive emotion. It's yeah, okay, things are still good, and I should be grateful for what has happened over the past decades. And it gives me some hope for the future, at least that.
I think that's a great point. I like to give a positive spin to everything.
Right.
And so I think that's a great point, that we should look at things and see the problems, not pretend we don't see them, but then use that as fuel to contribute in some way, right? So I think that's absolutely falling into a mindset of, well, everything's horrible and there's nothing we can do. Yeah, that doesn't help anybody. So I absolutely agree. We look at reality, we accept reality, we acknowledge reality, let's put it that way. But we use it as motivation to do better. Because, I mean, when we say system, yes, there is a system in place, but it's not like it's something that is beyond. The system is just the way things are being done right now. It's the way people are organized. It's not something inherent to our society. It can be changed, just like it was structured this way. So, yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and everything that we're trying to do. I mean, your podcast and the videos I do, all these efforts, we're trying to offer some value and trying to improve things in a way to the extent that we can, right? In the areas where we feel that we have some potential and some value to offer.
Right. And that's why we all try to discover our own niche, as you said. So some people decide to become lawyers. Some people think they're going to be good, I don't know, bridge layers or plumbers or I don't know what, medical teachers, or create great YouTube content. So maybe that's a good way to circle back to your YouTube content, because your videos, I primarily focus, your channel is called Nutrition Made Simple. Let's start with that. And so you start with nutrition, and for some reason, over time of medical school and research, etc., you decided that nutrition is a topic of significant enough importance to start a YouTube channel and start talking about it. So how did your interest for nutrition came about? Because that's also not given.
Yeah. In fact, when I started, I considered several different topics. I thought about talking about genetics. I thought about neuroscience, because at the time I was a research scientist at a neuroscience institute, and that I played around with that idea. The reason I landed on nutrition is that I thought it was a better crossroads of the different things that I was looking for. So it was something that I had some background in, that I had some personal interest in, but more importantly, where I thought that offering that bridge that I talked about, bridging people to the content, would be particularly useful. I mean, I could talk about, if I was making videos about genetics, I think there was a lot of interesting things that could be done, a lot of fascinating stuff that could be discussed on genetics. But I think the applicability for a viewer would be less than nutrition.
Mm.
With nutrition, there's just an element of immediate applicability, of immediately actionable, right? And the other thing is that when you look at the statistics and the different scientific studies that have been done, the impact of nutrition and lifestyle in general on the current state of health is enormous. Some estimates indicate that up to 80% of disease and death in the West particularly is tied to lifestyle and nutrition. And so the impact there is potentially enormous. The other thing that I was already aware of, but not to the extent that I am now, is that nutrition also touches on these other aspects that are absolutely of existential importance for us, like climate change. Mm-hmm. This is something that 5 years ago was already a little bit on my radar, but now with the research that has come up in terms of the different environmental impact of different food choices, it's something that has really struck me from the sustainability and the climate research. It's something that's becoming more and more mainstream as well. Mm. And so this has been an interesting additional perk to talking about this, that not only do you have a potential massive impact on people's health, but potentially on the health of the planet as well. So those are the reasons that I decided to start with nutrition, and the reasons that I stuck with it, because it keeps getting more and more relevant.
Let me ask you a follow-up question on what you just said regarding the fact that some estimates, they describe nutrition and lifestyle as being responsible for, responsible for 80% for the development of 80% of the different diseases. And lifestyle is a very broad term, because you can clump in nutrition and exercise is a huge one, and you can differentiate different types of exercise, and then you can talk about outdoor activity. I'm not necessarily talking about exercise here, but just being outside in the sun, being outside in nature. That's maybe a huge one. Then you can talk about the whole stress side of things and chronic stress and everything that has to do with that. And then you can talk additionally about sleep and the implication that sleep has on health. And so now we're left with, or I'm left with the question. I've been grappling with the question over the past couple of years. That I also have been interested in lifestyle intervention and treatment of diseases by using the implementation of lifestyle intervention as opposed to only medication, how it's usually being done or taught in medical school, unfortunately, still. I was hoping to receive some information, and we did receive a little bit, but it's always being told as a side note. So it's lifestyle is important, and here are the meds. I'm like, But okay, so the question is, and I still didn't arrive at an answer that satisfies me necessarily, because at the beginning I was hyper focused on nutrition, and I feel like so many health enthusiasts are hyper focused on one thing, and that's the foods that you put in your mouth. And I've wondered whether the benefits of improving your diet go beyond the act of removing processed foods from your diet, whether you can achieve additional great additional improvement in your health by doing more than just eating whole foods, whether that's enough. And then all major extra benefits can be accrued by exercise and sun and nature and stress. I've been diving in that, going down that rabbit hole recently, because that seems to be a very overlooked topic. So what's your thoughts on that?
I suspect that it's more than a suspicion, that it's clearly multifactorial. And so there's no question that exercise plays a role. There's no question that not smoking plays a role, that sleep plays a role. There's no question about that. But there's also no question that nutrition per se, even keeping everything else constant, plays a massive role in disease. And when you look at the major causes of disease and death in our society, they're all heavily influenced by nutrition. Whether it's cardiovascular disease, whether it's diabetes, whether it's Alzheimer's, cancer, they all have a tie to disease, and a pretty powerful one. Yes, ultra-processed foods are, without a doubt, a big issue in our society, the excess of ultra-processed foods everywhere. Is that the only thing? I think it's always hard, in general, when these topics have been attempted to be placed on one factor. I've found that not entirely explain the full picture. And so if we remove all the processed foods, let's say, for example, when you say whole foods, are you including added salt or no, as an example? Right?
Personally, I would say, if you exclude ultra-processed foods, you get rid of a large food group that contains added salt. And so if you totally exclude ultra-processed foods, suddenly you have no salt in your diet. So I think then, in that context, I would say adding salt to taste, I would consider to be part of the whole food diet, personally.
Right. So it would depend, right? So and that's also nuanced, because the majority of the sodium that people consume in our society is coming from ultra-processed foods. So in a way, just replacing that would already be an improvement. And that's assuming that they wouldn't then add all that salt to their food at the table. But so I was bringing that up because it's one example where, just by depending on the amount that you add, we have a body of literature that indicates that if you add enough to increase your blood pressure significantly, then you could raise your risk of cardiovascular disease, for example, right? Even without any ultra-processed foods per se. It's just one example. There's other research, so it would depend largely on the composition of the diet. I think clearly removing or moderating ultra-processed foods for the average Westerner, nobody argues that would be a good move. Is that going to deliver 100% of the benefits? I doubt it. So there is just too much research on the composition of things and the proportions of things. I'm trying to think of another good example besides salt. Salt is one that I think you could clearly make a case that you could increase your risk of disease by adding too much. But I mean, yeah, you could have. So, for example, to go to one piece of research that is often cited is the substitution analysis between refined carbohydrates and saturated fat. And this is sometimes oversimplified because it's just one pixel in the picture, right? But that substitution analysis indicates that if we replace refined carbohydrates with saturated fat 1-to-1, that not much difference would be made in cardiovascular disease risk. So it's just one example. Again, for example, when people say whole foods, is butter included, right? If for example food is being lathered with butter, I think most people would not include butter in the category of whole foods, but you never know, and people have their own definitions of things. But so it's just an example that you could, depending on how you design the diet, you could easily, not to mention, you could design a diet all of whole foods that lacks an essential nutrient. I mean, right there, you could have a problem, even in the short term, with lacking an essential nutrient, with lacking, so you could easily, let's say, for example, diets that are, for example, 100% fruit or 100% raw vegan.
Right.
I wouldn't go as far as saying that it's impossible to eat that way and design it healthy, but
it's certainly problematic. Same as stuff like carnivore diets. Clearly possible. Like we have all these Michaela Peterson people who have problems, who go to that, who start following that diet, and they survive. And it's clearly possible, but it's definitely problematic. Maybe complicated. Maybe it's lacking certain nutrients. That's definitely an issue.
That's a good example. I wasn't thinking about that. That's a good example. We actually made a video.
I've seen that one.
I think it was that young woman. Yeah. So is the lady that was giving you a speech at Oxford, right?
Exactly. That's Michaela. That's the daughter of Jordan Peterson. And he's actually also following that diet because he's also had some autoimmune depressive symptoms, something like that.
Right. I think that's one example that you could clearly make a scientific case. I mean, in her case, as we covered in the video, from what she said, she was so limited in what she could do.
Mhm.
Like she was there was a personal account of trying to introduce other foods and just not
Right.
being able to. So as we tried to say in the video, look, if you're somebody that was in this position, what are you going to tell them? That you have other foods and just be in pain all day? That's not advice that anybody's going to take seriously.
Mhm.
But that's an extreme example of a diet that, well, I think if I remember correctly, she said her diet was all steaks, salt, and water.
Yes.
So right there, that's what because I remember including that in the video.
No, it's that. It's actually that and nothing else. Yeah.
So
I think maybe from time to time I can't quite remember, but maybe she said on a couple podcasts that she sometimes includes like liver from time to time, like rarely, but it's still in the realm of only animal foods.
Yeah. So I mean, when we made that video, we made it from the angle of somebody who's in a position where they pretty much are out of options because of some medical condition, and they haven't figured out. There's no solution for that in that specific case, right? I'm not saying that there isn't a solution in general.
Yes.
I'm saying she hasn't found one that works for her, other than that extreme elimination diet that puts her that controls her symptoms. So of course she has to do it. But that's not. Nobody would advise that diet in general for an individual who has choice.
Yeah.
Just like nobody would advise to somebody who's doing fine on a more balanced diet, whether it's a Mediterranean diet or something like that. Nobody would say, "Hey, eliminate everything except the apples. Just eat apples all day." Nobody in professional nutrition would advise that off the bat, because it would make it virtually impossible to get all your essential nutrients. So yeah, it's.
Let me try to phrase my question a little bit differently, because have you heard of the work of written by Weston Price? Have you encountered Weston Price?
I've heard of it, and I looked at the website a couple of years ago, but I'm not familiar.
So Weston Price was a dentist living back in the 30s or 40s, right. And he's long dead. He's written a great. I've been reading it recently, and it's quite interesting to read. And the book is called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and it's a study of different indigenous cultures. So he's been traveling around the world and visiting different cultures, because his question that he was grappling with was basically, why the hell do I see in the civilized world all the time patients with crooked teeth and gum disease, etc. Like that can be the norm. And so are there any cultures who don't have these diseases, these sorts of abnormalities? And he's been traveling to he called them primitive isolated primitive cultures all around the world. And he made some very interesting findings. Among the most important among them is probably the fact that almost all of them presented like supreme health markers, especially when it comes to their teeth and general physical health. And that's why he called the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, because the greatest link that he could that he tried to make in the book was that it was all mostly tied to the nutritional quality. However, that being said, another observation was that the diet of the diets of the indigenous cultures, it varied a lot from place to place. So you couldn't possibly make the case that they followed one specific particular dietary framework and became all healthy. You shouldn't even try to make that case, because those who were living close to the sea were eating lots of seafoods. Hunter-gatherers were relying on meat. Farmers were having their vegetables and their dairy produce, and then you had Eskimos who had no plants, and other regions who had lots of plants. So it's been very different among these different cultures. And so what I'm trying to say is, even if you have different dietary compositions, does it does the exact diet, does the exact composition of different food groups matter in the final analysis, given that, you know, you, like, let's assume that you have a person who doesn't eat 1 kilogram of butter a day, who doesn't salt their foods with like 20 grams of salt per day. So a reasonable diet. Does it then make a huge difference whether the person eats like more vegetables or less vegetables, more meat or less meat, more fish, less fish, more eggs, less eggs, etc.? And, you know, after visiting all these dietary camps and trying to find out what they all trying to say, I have, you know, not really come to any particular conclusion, but my sense is that as long as you have this whole food, what would you say, intention to include mostly whole foods and, you know, focus on those food groups that you find most enjoyable, let's say, or most seasonal, you could even make the argument that that's a good thing to try, then the majority of your health benefits, if you have that as your baseline, will maybe eventually come from additional exercise, good sleep, and yeah. So that's, well, yeah, it's like rambling around because I haven't really made up my mind yet. No, and that's exactly why I also wanted to have you on and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think I understand your question. So to comment specifically on this type of, like, it's called ecological data, right? When you go around and get specific populations, specific tribes somewhere.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's kind of like when certain people in the vegan community bring up the blue zones and they say, oh, there's the centenarians, and so everybody should be eating. Sometimes they'll say, oh, everybody should be eating a vegan diet because of the blue zones, even though none of the blue zones are vegans.
Right.
But so that's kind of just a general comment that that type of evidence tends to get stretched. Right? People tend to overclaim from that type of evidence. It's interesting evidence, and I think, for example, it's good hypothesis generating data. It's very difficult to, exactly as you said, it's very difficult to come up with cause and effect from those from those observations. And a lot of times, what you find when you go into the literature is some of the observations or some of the reports aren't that reliable. So, for example, with you touched on the Inuits, right? And I've looked a little bit into the literature back into the 70s and stuff, and so there were some initial reports. I forget the name, but it was two Norwegian explorers and scientists who made those initial observations, and there was a report where they said, "Oh, these people seem to have no cardiovascular disease," and that started a whole kind of trend of the omega-3s and all these things.
Right.
But what happened subsequently was that other researchers went back and did more careful analysis and did kind of imaging and more careful reporting, and they found that there was actually pretty extensive atherosclerosis in this population. And in some of the reports, they say it's actually, the prevalence is not that different from a Western population. Now, you'd have to go back and see, like, how clean are these people's diets? Are they, introducing some of the modern foods? There are all these complications, and so. And
the cold also, like that might be a huge additional stress factor for the vascular system. Like the cold they're exposed to all the time. I think we certainly underestimate that factor because they're never in warm environment, and you have like constant, not constant, but reasonably increased sympathetic nervous system activation.
Yeah,
and stuff like that.
Right, and so those are good examples of confounders that when we look at these ecological data, it's virtually impossible to come up with something that's very, very reliable in terms of cause and effect. And then you have genetics, of course, right? By definition, you're looking at people who have different genetics. And basically, you don't have a control group. Like, your control group is going to be, here are some people in, in Boston compared to people in a tribe somewhere in an island.
But you know, let me quickly comment on that, because what Weston A. Price tried to do in order to see how strong the genetic components influence the outcomes was to follow up on those individuals who transitioned from the indigenous tribes into the civilization right next to the tribe. And so that's why he specified that he looked at isolated groups, and then he looked at those who were once living according to the traditional lifestyle, but then moved to the civilization. And you know, the pattern was, they're like different numbers, etc., but the pattern was the same. They became sicker, and the next generation had horrible teeth. That was basically the pattern. And that was really interesting, because that means if there is a genetic component, it's probably not as massive as we think it could be. So that's a good hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we see this across the literature. For example, studies looking at Japan versus the US, right? And then people who come from Japan to the US, or people from Hawaii that go to, so that's a reproducible finding, that when people move to a different country, they kind of develop the diseases of that country. So I would agree that there's clearly a big factor that is environmental. That could be a big part of it. Could be nutrition, and could be the junkier foods. It could also be other environmental factors, you know, just behavioral of the society that they're in. But so yeah, in general, it's the ecological data is going to be difficult to rely on, but it's good, you know, hypothesis generating and to kind of create some hypotheses. But yeah, when we look at things like both, for example, both observational data and interventional, like randomized controlled trials of swapping foods, and you're looking at mostly whole foods, you do see some differences, not always. So it depends on the swap, right? But for example, I'm looking at this paper now that just came out, where from Stanford, from Christopher Gardner. They just published this comparison between it's a keto diet and a Mediterranean diet, and it's a randomized controlled trial, and both are clean, right? So both are avoiding a lot of junk food. So it's a clean keto and a clean Mediterranean, and a lot of the benefits are seen in both of the groups lost weight, but they do see some differences. The LDL cholesterol tends to go up a bit more on the keto, but the keto has a little bit better glucose control, at least in the short term. So there's like some differences across. And you see this in a lot of different studies, swapping foods. So it has to do with the context. It has to do with the individual and kind of the balance of these foods. So for example, if you take somebody who's eating, let's say I'm eating, you know, 5 servings of fruit a day, and I go to 6 servings of fruit, am I going to see a big difference in the long run? Probably not, right? When you get closer to the extremes, when you get to from people who consume very little fruits and vegetables, and you start adding back, then you see a big effect initially, and then it kind of tends to plateau, as there's a law of diminishing returns, right? It tends to plateau after a while. Adding more doesn't make as much of a difference. The same, for example, with the studies that have looked at cholesterol, for example, dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol, right? You tend to see dynamic range is mainly in that initial stage. So people who consume no dietary cholesterol and they start consuming it, you see that initial rise, but then pretty quickly after, I don't know if it's 100 or 200 milligrams a day approximately, it kind of plateaus and it doesn't matter anymore. If you add another egg on top of two or three eggs, and then you no longer see a rise. So yeah, it all
only maybe if you have these individuals who are kind of hyper absorbers, and then maybe an additional egg would make a difference. But for the general population, perhaps presumably there is not much difference whether you add additional cholesterol or not. Yeah,
and that's a great point too, is the individual variability. So some people can handle more than others. That's always going to be the case. So I talk to a lot of people who have concerns about their lipids because of cardiovascular disease, and there's an enormous variability. So I'll make a video about ApoB and cholesterol and these things, and I'll have comments from across the board. Some people will say, well, the science must be wrong because I eat a lot of saturated fat and my lipids are great, right? And other people will say the science must be wrong because I cut out all of these foods and I still have bad lipids. So you clearly see that there's a genetic element at play as well. And so some people just need to be more strict than others. That's always the case. Some people can be a bit more lax with their food and others can't. They'll put on weight a little bit easier. But at the end of the day, there is a dynamic range, and there is a trend that is the same for all humans. Nobody is a robot. So, but the exact amounts and the exact stimulus to dose response is going to vary from individual to individual. So that's always going to be a source of variability and a source of a little bit of confusion as well.
Yeah, let me phrase it this way. So if you imagine you would have a patient, I mean it's super difficult to generalize. So that's maybe let's take an example. You got a patient, and the patient is has certain chronic conditions, and you try to implement specific lifestyle interventions. And now I'm still trying to ask you the same question in a different way, because it's still difficult to find a satisfactory answer to it. But let's say you have different options at hand, because you have basically these 5, let's say, pillars of health, of lifestyle intervention that you could tackle individually. You could look at nutrition, you could look at sleep, you could look at stress, you could look at exercise. And personally, I see lots of value in being outdoors in nature, in the sun, etc. So I personally include that as an additional pillar. And now, back then, let's say 2 years ago, I would say, the most important focus should be on nutrition. And in my research, in my attempt to learn more about this in this field of nutrition, I was focusing on the most. Today, I would say, I was inappropriately focusing on details which wouldn't probably make much difference in health outcomes if I had a patient. And so now, if I had the patient in front of me, what would be most sensible and worth the time and effort to invest that time and effort in order to achieve the greatest outcomes in terms of benefits for the patient's health? And to some degree, I have moved a little bit away from the hyper focus on nutrition. And right now, I would say start with going outside, start with improving your relationships and reducing your stress, and start with exercise, and do some nutritional things like excluding processed foods, etc. But don't focus too much on the details of, oh, I can't eat this one food because something horrible will happen, or I can only eat that because if I don't, then I miss a vitamin and then I'm going to die tomorrow. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But
yeah, no, those are great points. I think there's definitely a point, and this is something that we should be aware of talking about nutrition, because I think the majority of typical Westerners, certainly in the U.S., are not, consuming nutrition content on a daily basis. Maybe they'll read an article on Cosmo or something about how to lose weight in 30 days or something like that. But this type of intense focus is going to be a very specific slice of the population. And so I think what you're saying is very important to bear in mind, that after you have the basic building blocks in place, obsessing over details to the extent that you lose the joy of eating, or that you're stressed out. It can even, in some cases, I can easily imagine that it could offset the benefits after you reach those diminished.
I've actually observed it in my life to some extent. So I wasn't stressed out about nutrition, but to some degree I was, as you said, I felt as though the stress that came along with the research and with the intense focus in that kind of maybe slightly offset the benefits that I gained from good nutrition. Maybe not totally, maybe not to 100%, but you're having maybe arguments with people about stupid details, because you say, why are you eating that? You shouldn't be doing it because you're attached to a certain dietary ideology. I have certainly visited several camps, so I know the feeling of believing something wholeheartedly, you know, and then being triggered by someone who think that's stupid, and changing the beliefs. And I've undergone that process several times, and I think that's what we all have to do as scientists, as good scientists.
Yep.
But you know what I'm saying? It's
a
difficult thing to contend with.
Yeah, and I think so. I think the aspect of flexibility is very important because, and when you're saying talk to a specific patient, yeah, that's that in a way that makes it easier. In a way, it's harder, and in a way, it's easier. But when you're talking to one person in particular, yeah, your advice and the things that you talk about can be more targeted. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're talking to one individual, what I would do is get an idea of the baseline. So if I'm talking to somebody, for example, who smokes like a chimney, that's clearly something where I'm going to ask some questions and I'm going to see how much room for improvement there is, how open the person is to changing that area, right? And if somebody who exercises, who exercises quite a bit and is generally, athletic, I'm not going to harp too much on the benefits of doing this exercise over that exercise. So you're going to target the focus depending on that baseline for that individual. But when you're talking about general science and when you're talking to a general audience, there is that difficulty. And so one thing that I try to convey a lot in my videos is this idea of the flexibility that once you have the basic building blocks in place, that you're not, gobbling ultra processed foods, that you're not, that you have a diet with fruits and vegetables, that you don't have, tons of alcohol in your diet, that you don't have an ungodly amount of added salt, that your markers are decent, that your glucose and your cholesterol and your ApoB, that these things are under control. Obsessing over, is fat toxic, is carbohydrate toxic? These things aren't really big building blocks of nutrition science in and of themselves. And I make a lot of videos about that. Like, look, this is a lot of these comparison studies find once you have the diets that are pretty well designed, they tend to find small differences in general.
Yes, that's maybe exactly the point I was trying to make, because also if we look at the hazard ratios, or if you look at like life expectancy, even if it is observational data, there's been lots of debate going on whether vegans live longer or not, whether in the blue zones if they're really vegetarian or vegan or not. But in general, I think you can conclude that vegans versus vegetarians versus omnivores, the life expectancy doesn't really differ that much, if at all. So, but there is an insane association between like smoking and life expectancy, or the hazard ratio are like nuts. It's like 20x. It's not 1.2, which we usually observe in observational data in terms of nutritional epidemiology. It's like 1.3. Wow. No, it's nothing. Look at smoking. It's 30x. That's like that's a significant hazard ratio. And also I've heard Peter Attia talk about resistance training a lot, and the benefits in terms of life expectancy seem to be, stellar, absolutely incomprehensible. And I've seen a great recently I came across also an observational study on, I think it was sun exposure in a Swedish cohort. Maybe you've heard of that paper. And the finding was that smokers with the highest amount of sun exposure had a similar life expectancy as non-smokers with the lowest amount. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. Smokers with the highest amount of sun exposure had a similar amount of lived as long as non-smokers with the lowest amount of sun exposure. So the sun exposure seemed to alleviate the risk that came along with smoking, and so that seemed to be more significant than the nutritional research. That's maybe the point I'm trying to make here.
So two observations there. One is that with those studies, like we'd have to look at the details. For example, that study with the tobacco and the sunlight, we'd have to really be careful in terms of the adjustment models. How much did they try to adjust for the confounding variables? Because that's something that, depending on how well adjusted it is, it could be incredibly confounded. You could have all kinds of different variables. People who are outside more.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the confounding plays a huge role here. But the fact that there was a significant and also large difference in life expectancy proves, at least to me, proves the point that there is more to the other factors than if we only keep looking at nutrition, and forget if we hyper focus and obsess about details in terms of diet. And again, it sounds as if I tried to make the argument that diet is not important. That's not what I'm saying at all, because diet is crucially important, and we discussed that, I think. And
agreement on the general idea that focusing on minutiae gets to a point where you're probably not getting much added benefit.
Right.
The question then becomes, what exactly is minutiae, right? That's where the difficulty is going to come. Another thing that is important to note is that these associations, the 1.3, the 1.2, yes, you tend to see that, but mainly when you look at one food at a time, like one isolated food in a dietary pattern.
That's right.
But when you look at changes in the entire dietary pattern without changing anything else, you do see much more robust outcome differences. And
but so is it also if we compare healthy dietary patterns between each other? Or is it the comparison between unhealthy dietary pattern and another healthy dietary pattern of your choice? Because then clearly I would expect to see a great differences between in the health outcomes.
Right. It's a bit of a mix, but you can find examples where the control diet wasn't particularly junky. If you look at these large Mediterranean diet studies like Predimed and Lyon, they have very impressive, especially Lyon is even stronger than Predimed. Like they have I forget if it's 50 to 80% reduction in cardiovascular risk.
Right.
And although with Lyon, I would agree with you that the control diet was a bit junky. With Predimed, it was a better designed a low-fat diet. It wasn't super low-fat, and people will complain, that wasn't low-fat diet. But they called it a low-fat diet, let's put it that way. But the differences it's not like one diet was McDonald's and the other diet is, all salads or something like that. Those diets are much closer in terms of the general.
I see.
And they still found 30% reduction in cardiovascular disease outcomes over 5 years, which is pretty striking, because if you were to extend that to the lifetime, you probably get to twofold or something like that.
Good point,
but yeah, and then with the studies, yes, if you start to include the component of the ultra processed foods, you clearly that's a factor, right? And you start to see a big difference with that as well. But even leaving that aside, just looking, for example, at the presence or absence of fruits and vegetables, the amount of, for example, processed red meats, although that technically could be considered also not a whole food, depending on how people define it. But yeah, there are studies that you could easily find when they look at all of these changes put together, that you see pretty striking differences in disease risk, where you could make a case that diet alone is clearly a substantial factor. But I'm not disagreeing with you at all that you get to a point when somebody's already doing most of the, when somebody is eating a somewhat careful diet, and yeah, does it matter if it's a Mediterranean diet or if it's a careful omnivore diet, or the vegetarian diet or the pescatarian diet? Probably not a huge amount. It would depend on the composition. It would depend on the individual as well. There might be some individual differences, but in terms of populationally, once you're under this umbrella of a diet that kind of checks the main boxes, I don't think you'd see a huge difference. And that's generally what we try to convey in the videos, because I think that's what the science conveys for the most part.
Yeah, and maybe also considering the well, I wouldn't say fact, but it's highly likely that a large number of the audience that follows you, for example, is already health conscious to some extent. And so we could assume that they have already implemented certain things, and we already have that healthy user bias going on in our community, in our health community in general. It doesn't matter if it's, by the way, it doesn't matter if it's vegan or keto or anything else. There is this prevailing healthy user bias among all these folks because they all try to exercise and drink less and smoke less and exclude processed foods. That's kind of the general pattern, and you know, create more positive social relationships, etc. That's, you know, that's a really important one that I've came to realize recently, because if you look at in my opinion, one of the major disease culprits of Western civilization, which is something, you know, you could say insulin resistance, diabetes, one of these terms, because it seems to be linked to many diseases.
Yeah.
Then stress and anything that goes along with stress is directly linked to insulin resistance and diabetes. Like physiologically, it can be triggered and exacerbated by stressful life. And
right.
So I think that's underestimated. And if we have these conversations, we need, at least I strongly believe that's the case, we need to make people aware of the fact that if they obsess about details, as we discussed, then it might be way more harmful to their health than if they kept their general pattern, didn't obsess too much about tiny and significant details, and focused on the things that truly matter.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that general idea. And I think it's true that to some extent, people who gravitate towards nutrition, in a way, they are people who are aware of these other aspects of their life. There is also a component of people who have a disease or a background of some health scare that they had, right? So people who were obese or who had diabetes or who had.
You hear these stories all the time. That's such a common pattern. You have, I don't know how it was in your case. I certainly didn't have any health issues, but I feel as if I am some sort of exception in this health space, because so many people they had to undergo this you know, up and down journey of health disease, and maybe some family member was extremely sick, and then they discovered something and completely transformed their life, and they went down this crazy rabbit hole of health and like nutrition and training and exercise, and everything has to do with that, and they became healthy. So you're right, I've also made that observation.
I am also mostly an exception in that I didn't have any disease when I started out. I wasn't, you know, struggling with overweight or obesity. I wasn't diabetic. I didn't. The only thing is my cholesterol was starting to go up as I got older. I was about in my mid-30s when I started really getting into this in more detail and like changing my diet more dramatically. And I saw my cholesterol come down pretty clearly, pretty dramatically.
Right.
But in subjective terms, in terms of something that I felt, no. And I actually talk about that in the videos, that I am sort of a mutant in some ways because I can eat whatever and I feel the same. So if I eat a cheaper meal, or if I eat a more plant meal or a more animal meal, I don't feel a major difference. Like if I forgot what I ate, I almost couldn't tell what I ate. Right. But a lot of people, even in my close family, are not like that. They report a huge subjective difference when they change diet. So in a way, I understand what you're saying. Like for me, it wasn't like, oh my God, my health is crumbling. I have to understand. It wasn't so much that. It was more, you know, I had curiosity about nutrition, and I already had that angle in my professional life. Let's say, and so it kind of naturally carried over to my personal life, that I just started implementing more and more the things that I saw, you know, in the literature as I was looking at it professionally. But yeah, I agree with that. That seems to be a huge component in the nutrition sphere, that a lot of people have this before and after, the pictures, right? The before and after pictures and the transformation.
And how can we reconcile the fact that we as human species are are reasonably similar in our physiology and biochemistry and anatomy, and our bodies function similarly. Otherwise, we would not be considered to be like one species.
Yeah.
However, on the other hand, you have these insane individual differences between like how people react to different food groups or to different diets even. I mean, I have friends that told me how they went vegan and they felt horrible. They stopped veganism and now they're like feeling so much better. And I have also friends who also went vegan, didn't feel horrible. And so you have these vast differences between individuals. And I'm just curious about how this is possible, basically. Maybe that's a good way to put it, because we should be very similar in some sense, but we apparently are not at all.
Yeah. Welcome to my YouTube comment section. Every day we get every single day somebody, hey, you're telling people that carbohydrate is not necessarily bad, and when I eat some carbs, my head explodes, and the other guy is saying, when I love carbs and I feel great. When I eat fat, my head explodes, and so you have this constant fight. I think there's a mix of factors. There's clearly an element of commonality. There's clearly commonality between us. But then there's also a component that when people say, for example, I went on a XYZ diet, right? Often they mean very different things. So for some people, a vegan diet might be a well-designed vegan diet. For other people, it might be a junky vegan diet, or there might be something missing. They might not have supplemented with B12. It's surprisingly common. Right. So a lot of times it's the extrapolation. It's the logical leap between I tried diet XYZ and then it didn't work for me. But it's like, what did you actually do, right?
And so do you think in the final analysis it can be boiled down to nutrients? Because that might be one factor. Like B12 could be one example in the vegan diet, but we could bring several examples, like not only the vegan diet. I might have a particular bias towards disliking vegan diet for their nutritional inadequacy. And one other example that comes to mind is like vitamin A. Like some people are better at converting beta carotene to vitamin A to retinol, and some people, they can eat carrots all day long and they will not be able to adequately produce enough retinol in their bodies. And same can be said for like omega-3s and EPA and DHA. Same argument can be made for iron absorption. Some people are better, some people are worse. Maybe someone like, look, one example could be even our favorite molecule, that's cholesterol. Like some people can be bad at synthesizing cholesterol, and if they eat adequate amount, they might feel good. And I've heard Chris Masterjohn. I'm familiar with Chris Masterjohn. He's a nutritional scientist, and he did a lot of work on nutrients, and he's also talking a lot about Weston Price, and that was kind of his hypothesis that he might have some issues. He might have had some issues with cholesterol synthesis when he was on a vegan diet, and I can't quite remember why he came to that conclusion, but there are just several reasons for why people could feel bad. But do you think it's like only nutrients, or is there more to that component?
There's definitely more to that. I think there's probably variability, physiological variability. So, for example, when you look at a study like Diet Fits, are you familiar with Diet Fits from Christopher Gardner as well? So they.
Oh, I think I've heard of that study. Yeah.
Yeah, they tried to give people, and there are other examples, but basically they try to give people a low carb diet and a high carb and a low fat. They compared the two, and they didn't see a big difference between the two groups. But then when you look individually, you see a massive difference in terms of some people were doing really well on the low carb diet, some people were doing really well on the low fat diet, and vice versa. So there's clearly an individual difference. Now the question is, are those people that weren't adherent, that were cheating a lot or something, or are those people that were pretty faithful, but physiologically that wasn't the right diet for them? That's a harder question. And in that paper they tried to identify from a genetic. They had like a genetic marker, and they had like an insulin resistance marker, or was it an insulin level? And that didn't seem to explain the differences.
Okay.
But of course, it doesn't rule out that there are other differences that could explain the disparity. But there's clearly an individual preference, let's say, or an individual propensity to do better on different dietary compositions.
Do you have like hypotheses for what other physiological differences might be responsible for heterogeneity in response in terms of different dietary interventions, apart from the thing which we already addressed, which is like nutrients and the amount of nutrients that you can absorb and your ability to synthesize them and maybe convert them? So apart from that,
yeah, I mean, I could speculate. There, I remember seeing research, for example, on glucose response from with different foods, and they found a big individual difference.
Oh,
different
yeah.
people eat the same food and would have a very different, glucose curve.
Right, I remember that one. That was fascinating.
Yeah, that's one kind of random example. Another thing would be satiety. I mean, just at an anecdotal level, a lot of people report with some foods not feeling satiated, and with other foods feeling very satiated. I mean, for example, one thing that I keep hearing on social media, these different versions, is oatmeal, right? Some people say, oh, I eat oatmeal and I'm full for hours, and others say, well, if I eat oatmeal, I need to eat another meal right after. Who am I to say that either side is not being honest? I believe them. So there probably is an element of satiety there that might not. And obviously, there could be also, if you put these people in a controlled study where you feed them the same amount of oatmeal, where you control what else they're eating and the time of eating, maybe you'll find that the difference is not as robust or as dramatic as they report. But might there be an individual difference in terms of satiety? I wouldn't be surprised. And so some people might do better on a diet that has more whole carbs. Someone else might do better on a diet that has more fat content. I'm completely open to that. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Certainly, people seem to report that, and I don't see a problem. I mean, I certainly don't see an issue if people do better. For example, eating a high carb, low fat diet, and another guy feels better eating a lower carb, higher fat diet. I don't see why they shouldn't play with that and design a diet that works for them, that they're able to sustain long term. I would
for some reason, certain people seem to be offended by the fact that their diet doesn't work for everyone, and and I have experienced that on myself. Like back then when it all started, I was convinced that the more vegetables you eat, the better. I tried it out. I felt some bloating issues because I was eating like ridiculous amounts. I think it was more than just 5 servings a day. Then I kind of came across the whole low carb ketogenic space, and I was convinced that carbs are the enemy. And and whenever some counter evidence popped up that carbohydrates might be like okay or like good, and then there was like one thing that convinced me that my whole hypothesis doesn't really hold water. Evolutionary and physiologically, is the fact that we developed a taste for something that we have taste receptors for glucose. That tells us a lot. It means that this thing is valuable. It's so valuable that we developed I started looking through things through this lens of evolution more. I tried to adopt that frame.
Yeah. At least in the ancestral environment, it was valuable, right?
Yes. But that might tell us different things. One conclusion might be it was rare, and we didn't came across glucose that often, and that's the reason why we find it so precious and developed that taste for it. But still, the fact that we developed a system to like it, basically, and that so many different functions and mechanisms are based on glucose production. We have like so many different pathways to synthesize glucose, just told me, okay, so maybe the whole carbohydrate is evil hypothesis or glucose is poison hypothesis isn't complete enough. And so going through these dietary camps, you recognize that there is more than just this one diet that might work for people. As you said, you have no problem if a high carb, low fat diet works for someone, but there's another one who tells you that a low carb, high fat diet works for that individual. That's totally fine. But every keto zealots will tell you that's not fine. It's no, my diet works. And vegan zealots will tell you it's also not fine. Only vegan diet will work. Have you had discussions with people on? I imagine you had tons of discussions on that front.
Every day, people will comment that, and I don't want to give the wrong impression. It's not like that's all the comments we get. That's a minority. Most of the comments are very supportive. Yeah, but every single day there's somebody who says, well, how can you say that, eating, for example, olive oil can be okay? It causes heart disease. And when I eat a diet without olive oil and I feel great, and and vice versa. I get somebody who says, how can you say that a food that contains carbohydrate can be health promoting? I eliminated carbohydrates and I feel the best I've ever felt at 75. So we get these comments every day. And I think it's important to not dismiss what people are saying, not fall into a headspace where you're like, you don't know what you're talking about, to not become arrogant like that. And so, but at the same time, it helps to be exposed to this diversity, because I think if all you see all day long is content saying that all fat is bad, you want to have a low-fat diet, it's the only healthy diet. If you introduce any form of fat in your diet, you're gonna kill yourself. If this is all that you're exposed to, all the papers that are being shared seem to point in this direction. All the experts that are being talked about seem to suggest this. Yeah, you're going to form this worldview, and then you're going to bristle when something else is suggested. But if you are either exposed to different diet camps, let's call it, or if you are forced to go through the literature in a systematic way, as you and I kind of have to do, very, very quickly those ideas crumble. I mean, they don't last very long at all. And so when you start hearing these ideas that are very fundamentalist, like this macronutrient is always bad, this macronutrient is always good. If you're looking at the literature, that doesn't last a weekend. And so it's relatively simple to, if you're kind of exposed to the science directly, to not fall too much into that trap.
And it's hard, though. It's really difficult. It's really difficult because we like to associate with a group, let's say. And if there's many people that support, so many, like if there's a bunch of people that support your viewpoint, and you listen, and you have that selection bias acting upon you, and you select the information that you like, and then suddenly you come across an information that pokes a giant hole in your entire belief system. You'd be like, you have two options: to question your entire belief system, which means lots of work to do, and it means to move away from the group you have associated with, to find yourself in temporary chaos, let's say, and restructure the world around you. I mean, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult. The other option is to just dismiss and ignore the information that has been presented and just move on with your camp life. So,
and I see, this is one thing that I've tried to ask people, because I see a clear divide. I clearly see these reactions. I get people every day who comment and say, thank you so much for these videos. I was in this camp XYZ, and I thought that this was the only healthy diet and everything else was poison. And by seeing your content and by going through these studies, I now realize that it wasn't quite true. So I clearly see people who are open to things and who take this stuff on board and are open to new information. But I also see enormous resistance. And I see emotional resistance every single day. People who see a video and they just react, they lash out emotionally, right? Because you're, exactly as you said, you're questioning their entire worldview.
Right.
Even if you're not aggressive, and even if you're not attacking them personally, just the fact that you're saying something that if it were found to be true, their entire worldview would be questioned. That's very, very difficult for some people to consider. So I clearly see these reactions. And I don't know exactly the perfect way to communicate with the different.
That would be my next question.
Yeah.
How do we approach that?
Yeah, I don't have a perfect answer to that. That's something that I'm sort of developing with time as I make the videos and as I interact with people. One thing that I think is very important is not to be judgmental and not to impose your ideas on other people. And that's something that is easier for me to do because it's kind of my nature. I don't want necessarily people to believe what I believe. And I don't want people to watch my video and go do the thing I said. Like, I don't care about that. What I want is for people to have access to the information so that they can make their decision, right? An informed decision.
Right.
If somebody chooses to smoke but understands the risks, I have no problem with that. And it's the same for food. What worries me is that a lot of people are making decisions that not being aware of the information that's out there. So I think not being judgmental is one big factor. If people feel like you're attacking them personally, then they just want to disagree with you reflexively. I don't know. The other thing is trying to put yourself in people's shoes as well. And nobody knows everything that's out there. Nobody is omniscient. So I think you're trying to discuss science and you're trying to show things that are out there that you are familiar with, but that people might not have come across. But you're not trying to put on this show that you know everything that's out there to know, and it's not believable. It's not even a good headspace to be in, because then you will resist anything that goes against your ideas. So
I think that's a great point, that you're not omniscient, and that's exactly the reason why the guiding spirit, so to speak, should be a spirit of exploration first and foremost, and the desire to find out what is true and what's not, basically. So because you will never know everything, and I think if we keep approaching these problems with that spirit, I think we personally can kind of can't really make great major mistakes in that sense. Like, we certainly will, that's probably inevitable, but still, I think having conversations in general is like the only way we could approach that, because how else are you going to mediate between these groups if not by talking to them directly? And the next step would be, okay, so you talk to them and now try not to be judgmental, as you said.
That's one thing that I tried to cultivate from the beginning was that, and this stems from the reason I started making the videos, is that I saw a lot of diet content on the internet, but very little nutrition content.
Right.
So there were a lot of vegan podcasts, a lot of high carb podcasts, a lot of low carb podcasts, a lot of these content where it was like the person is on a certain diet, and that diet is the best diet, and every study supports that diet. And if you're and the entire presentation is here's how you do my diet, and if you're not doing that, you're missing out. And just by any exposure to the literature, you immediately you can tell that this is a very partial, warped view. And also by watching content from different people. One guy is the high fat diet, the other guy is the high carb diet, and they're both, the tone is very similar, but the idea is the opposite. So it's not really compelling. But what I thought was missing was just nutrition content, like just here's the science and you do with that what what works for you. So that was the reason I started making the videos. And in terms of being open-minded, I have a rule that if people share a study, a peer-reviewed study,
I see.
If I'm not familiar with it, I have to read it. And it doesn't matter who it is, and it doesn't matter even if they share it, and say, "Hey, you're a moron. Here's a study." The tone cannot be a reason for me to dismiss the content.
Content, yeah.
So I have to open it, and I have to go over it, and I have to add it to my notes, regardless of who said it or how they said it. So that's a personal rule that I have that forces me to keep adding nuance. Yeah, I think that's I think the bottom line is just to never stop learning, I think, and just keep exposing yourself to information. At the same time, there needs to be a system of mental hygiene, right? Because sometimes when we say, oh, just be open-minded, sometimes what people mean by that is just go try random stuff and forget everything you've learned, and that's not good either. So you do want to have a system, a heuristic system, or a system of reliability. Some sources of information are just more reliable than others, and you do want to form a system of decision making that takes that into account, right? So if you've seen decades of robust evidence showing X, somebody says, "Oh, but my anecdote goes against that." You're not going to dismiss that person. Listen to what they're saying, but you don't go, "Oh, okay, forget 50 years of research. Then this supersedes." That's not, that doesn't make sense. You're going to be confused all the time if you do that. So yeah, there needs to be a framework on which the information sits. But at the same time, yeah, I think avoiding a rigidity where we get to a point where we're like, I know everything. I know everything that's to know. That's not helpful.
No.
Reaching a healthy balance, I think, is the key.
Right, exactly. And to the last point you made about looking for different sources and sorting out which things are more reliable and which are less reliable. Yeah, I think you've made a couple of videos on that, how to approach scientific research in an appropriate way, and in a way that allows you to extract the biggest amount of reliable information out of your research. So I think that's a good point to keep in mind, but that requires knowledge and practice, because at the beginning, everything, if you don't have a clue about the topic, then every bit of information will seem equally reliable or equally unreliable for that sake. So at the beginning, you just have to fight through this mess and find out what's good, what's bad, and with time, a picture will kind of
a general picture will crystallize, and it will become it will become clearer and clearer. Yeah, we try to make content, kind of trying to. Some people just want the bottom line. Like, here's the research on a specific topic. Some people just want that, but I know that some people do have an interest in the method and the backstage, and how can we do that ourselves. And so we try to once in a while create some content showing how to go through that process and how to make sense. Like, evidence isn't all created equal, right? If I show a study in rats and a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials in humans, that's not the same thing. So that helps, and people don't need to become experts, or don't need to spend their whole lives reading studies, but just understanding the basics helps a lot, because a lot of times the confusion isn't that profound. They hear some claim, and either there's no evidence, and they don't necessarily realize that that you need to show evidence for a claim, otherwise it has no substance. Just know can be a big mindset shift. Just knowing that you hear a claim, you go, okay, cool, what's the evidence? And then kind of a little bit going into, okay, what kind of evidence is it? Is it in humans? Is it just a clinical case, an isolated incident, or is it a structured, well-controlled trial? These things have very different heuristic value.
Sure.
So we try to sneak that in to give people a more balanced view, and to give them the tools so that they can do this themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great approach, I think, because there's that saying, you can give a man a fish and the man will eat the fish, or you can teach the man to catch fish, or you can teach the man to fish, and then the man will be able to supply himself with enough fish for the rest of his life. So I think if we Yeah, that's a great point. If we want to solve this problem sustainably and ensure that people can learn how to accurately read and interpret scientific information, then we could just as well give them the tools.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's room for that. Not everybody's going to be interested. I know that, but that's okay. You create a little bit different content, and some people do see value, and they do put it to good use. I've had people. We made a video just showing people how to find information. Because sometimes you have a disease or a family member has a disease and you want to find information, and just showing them very good resources and kind of databases where you can find just real nuggets of information, and showing them the basics of how to operate those tools. And I've had people contact me and say, "Man, this was life-changing. I found information here for my disease or for my brother's disease or whatever it was." And so that's something that not everybody necessarily is going to jump on those databases, but some people are going to put that to good use. So, yeah, I think it's good to kind of offer these different tools, and also like mix things up a little bit. Otherwise, it's boring for me too to always make the same video.
Right, right.
I want to like dip my toes a little bit in different things and to kind of explore. So, yeah.
But hey, you're doing well.
Thanks, man. This was really fun. And
yeah, I think we will not get into lipids today. That's a separate
right.
discussion. But there's one more thing I want to ask you, because I had recently a fellow doctor on the show whose name is Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. Are you familiar with Dr. Malcolm Kendrick?
Rings a bell.
He's been very I would say controversial in the whole LDL cholesterol space.
Okay.
And he is he's got a different hypothesis of atherosclerosis, which is partially dismissive of LDL being the major culprit. And so I think I'm well aware of your stance on that topic. I've watched many of your videos, and it's difficult because I'm somewhere between, I would say, because I'm still a medical student. I don't have enough knowledge, although at one point I thought I have enough knowledge to make a conclusion. And with time, I realized that's definitely not the case. And so I now wanted to have two different perspectives on the show. Unfortunately, we didn't came to talk about lipids because there's been many more things which were high on my priority list, which I wanted to ask you. And I'm glad we went through some of them at least. But one thing that I also asked Malcolm Kendrick, wanted to pose the same question to you, is whether you would be willing to participate in some sort of debate, let's say, between, I wouldn't quite call it a debate, because it should more be like a discussion between, like, let's say you and Malcolm Kendrick, because I find your points compelling and his points very compelling. And I would be very interested in see how you react to his arguments and how he reacts to your arguments, and see how this discussion would unfold. So what do you think about that?
I'm generally open to the idea of discussing something. It would depend on the specifics. My thing is, like, I don't mind having a discussion with anyone, but if it's something that's going to be public facing, I want to make sure that it's something that is going to contribute to clarity for the audience. That's the only thing I care about. So if the format and the approach is something that I'm convinced is going to contribute to people being clearer on a topic, I'm happy to participate. If I think it's going to just propagate confusion, in general, because a lot of these debates, sometimes the way they're structured, end up confusing people more than anything else. But so we'd have to look at what exactly is the topic, what is the evidence that's being put forward, that type of thing.
Right.
But I'm not closing the door.
Sure. Okay, so that's definitely great to hear. Okay, so I'll keep that in mind, and I'll reach out to you and maybe also Malcolm Kendrick when I'll get it. We're going to be able to maybe structure the conversation more clearly, and so I'll let you know. Okay.
Did you want to know anything about LDL specifically, or we'll talk about that at some other point? Or
no, we'll talk about that some other point. I think 2 hours is enough. That's good enough. That's good enough. Yeah. It's for me, LDL has been an insane rabbit hole, because just because of the reason I think that heart disease is so prevalent and so significant. It's such a significant contributor to disease and death that it just could not move away from that topic. And I just wasn't satisfied with what I was being told on a like merely looking at the superficial level. Like things happen and just give medication and that's that. And I'm being like, probably that's not it. And probably there's more to learn. And I still don't understand the physiology, and I still don't understand what's going on in the body. And that's why I'd rather fall down this rabbit hole and never get out of it again.
Right.
That was my experience with LDL.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion around lipids and heart disease. But so one thing as maybe just a parting note, right?
Right.
Because I mean, going into that would be another 7 hours. But one thing that I found helps a lot is that what we were talking about in terms of the structure of evidence. A lot of the confusion comes from looking at types of evidence that are more confounded and then dismissing or not necessarily paying attention to things that are more compelling forms of evidence, like clinical trials or these genetic experiments that get you closer to cause and effect. So what I've found in terms of explaining this to an audience is that usually the ideas that are floating out there, oh, it's this other thing that's not, cholesterol doesn't matter. A lot of times it stems from looking at maybe an observational study in isolation or from a mechanistic hypothesis in isolation, and sometimes not being fully aware or not paying as much attention to these experimental approaches that are much more compelling. And I find in general when I tried to explain those things, that when you show this perspective, things fall into place pretty well. But that's not to say that we know everything about heart disease and lipids. We don't. There's ongoing research. So there's plenty of things that are trying to be figured out.
Exactly.
But there's also a ton of things that are ideas floating on the internet that are just simply not true, and that that has to be said clearly. And they are not true because they have been directly addressed. Or even if we were to put it conservatively, we would say the evidence overwhelmingly points against it, right? And so, but that's just a matter of kind of going over that evidence and kind of structuring it in terms of the hierarchy. But it's not the simplest topic in the world, so it's understandable that there's a lot of discussion. Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to comment on that too much, but what I am going to say is that where my dissatisfaction with the I would say the opinion put forward by the medical establishment, where my dissatisfaction came from initially was my inability to reconcile the to comprehend the pathophysiology, the exact things that occur in the body. Because oftentimes what's really vague, it was like, you've got these particles, they kind of get stuck, and that's that. And be like, this doesn't make this, that in the manner in which you explained it to me, it doesn't make sense to me. So you see what I'm saying? It's like either it's not complete, or there has to be more nuance to that, or I just don't understand the pathophysiology, and that's why over the past couple of years I was diving deeper into the exact pathophysiological processes that underlie atherosclerosis, and so that's why it's so insanely complicated, because you could stay on that superficial level and just say these are roughly the things that happen, and these are the things you can do, and we end on that, or you go to the molecular level and look at what exactly happens in the artery, and so.
Yeah, there's ongoing research. I mean, for example, one big example is the mechanism of transcytosis, right? The mechanism through which the lipoproteins cross the endothelium. The main receptor for those ApoB lipoproteins was identified, I don't know, like 2 years ago. So, I mean, there's obviously ongoing stuff. There's a lot of research on the mechanistic aspects. So not every single molecular aspect is understood. So it's ongoing for sure.
Right. I just find it such a fascinating such a fascinating research field.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's been a quick. I'm glad that we quickly touched on lipids at the very end to just
Sure.
yeah, to just kind of open up the discussion for maybe future podcasts. But okay, let's maybe end here. That's a good place to end. It's been 2 hours, and yeah, it's been great talking with you. And do you have any comments, any kind of finishing thoughts?
No, man, this was really fun, really eclectic conversation. We touched on more general aspects of science interpretation and the personal views of things, which is very important. It's important to not get too sucked into the science so that you forget that there's a human aspect to it. It's
True.
crucial. So yeah, it was a balanced conversation. We touched on science, but we also touched on the human angle, the behavioral angle, the psychology behind it. So those are very important things to bear in mind. It was very very well rounded.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on, and I wish you lots of success with your YouTube channel and everything you do. And I hope you'll have less of these disturbing and evil comments. But as you said, they're apparently not constituting a large portion of the comments. So keep doing what you're doing. I think you're doing great work.
I don't mind at all. Those comments are part of the feedback and part of the response. So
exactly.
I appreciate those comments. If all the comments were just applause, I wouldn't learn anything.
That's a fair point.
Yeah, in a way, these are the most relevant comments are when there this diversity of opinions and reactions. That's where you really see that this diversity of human points of view. And at the end of the day, if we're working on science communication, that's what we're working on, right? If you're
exactly.
If you're just preaching to the choir, you're not making a difference. So no, that's very important.
Yeah, I think the way you approach all these things is awesome, and just keep doing your work and keep learning, as you said, always learning, always expanding the barriers, and just yeah.
Thanks for having me, man. Take care.
Awesome. Have a nice evening.
Bye.